It's pretty fascinating how some of the grandest theories of survival actually start out in the crucible of extreme precarity. Today, we're diving into the work of two absolute masters of resilience, Savio Antonio Vogt and Paulo Freire. Both of these guys emerged from environments completely defined by starvation and adversity. Freire from the crushing poverty of Recife, Brazil, and Vogt from the harsh realities of Calcutta, India. And because of that lived experience, they figured out really early on that true resilience, it's not just some academic theory. It is a literal matter of survival. So, in this explainer, we're going to explore the hidden architecture they discovered, the actual structures that keep human civilization alive.
So here's a fundamental question. Does just having more information guarantee that a civilization actually makes it? Well, both of our thinkers recognized right away that just dumping data into a system is a massive, dangerous illusion. Freire famously attacked this as the banking model of education. Treating people like empty vessels just waiting for deposits of disjointed facts. And Vogt, he diagnoses the exact same phenomenon in complex systems, calling it information decay. They both realized that a system can hold an absolute mountain of knowledge, but without the adaptive intelligence to actually interpret it, the whole thing just collapses. More data absolutely does not mean more resilience.
And this brings us to a really fundamental clash in how we actually build societies. Vogt frames this as a battle of directions. On one side, you have his top-down approach, which he calls the historical funnel. Think of this as the process where deep civilizational geometry and ancient wisdom are actively channeled down to govern everyday empirical data. But on the exact opposite side, you have the bottom-up approach of what he calls Nimrodic systems. These are those hyper-modern systems that obsess over unregulated expansion, massive acceleration, and those shiny, short-term visible metrics. But they do it entirely at the expense of deep, stabilizing roots.
Okay, let's jump right into the first part of this, the diagnosis, specifically looking at the SRA framework. Now, while Freire and Vogt shared the same basic diagnosis, their paths to a solution radically diverged. Freire leaned into Marxist dialectics to tackle societal oppression from the ground up. Vogt, however, took a totally different route. He turned to theoretical physics and space systems to develop this concept called scale-regulated aggregation, or SRA. Basically, he applied hardcore structural physics to human learning. He proved mathematically that what works perfectly fine on a small scale becomes incredibly unstable on a global scale if it just expands additively, without cultivating the deep relationships needed to actually hold that new weight. So, when these Nimrodic systems expand relentlessly without those stabilizing relationships, they literally start to crack under their own unregulated weight. And the scary part is, the collapse isn't some sudden, dramatic explosion. It's a slow rot. Mentorship fractures. Top scientific talent just migrates away from unstable regions. Institutional trust silently evaporates. The entire system suffers this massive decline in distributed resilience as tiny, almost invisible asymmetries just keep accumulating. It actually begs a pretty uncomfortable question. Do you recognize any of these symptoms in the institutions you interact with every single day?
To counter all this decay, Vogt introduces his concept of geometry. And here he's talking about the ultimate top-down historical funnel. See, a civilization survives by actively preserving architectural relationships that can actually outlast political chaos. It's not about hoarding terabytes of data on servers somewhere, it's about maintaining the highly structured bonds of mentorship, interpretation, and shared meaning that keep that information alive and adaptable, no matter how crazy historical conditions get.
Moving right along to part 2, let's look at the solution, the AM-Regulator.
If unregulated expansion is the disease here, the AM-Regulator is Vogt's mathematical counterattack against that Nimrodic expansion. Think of it as a super rigid structural tool designed specifically to temper additive expansion, things like enrolling massive amounts of students or just endlessly building new infrastructure, with multiplicative regulation. In really simple terms, it enforces a hard, non-negotiable rule. You absolutely must guarantee structural stability and deep professional trust before you are allowed to grow. When you look at this breakdown, you can see that when systems expand normally, they might look super successful on the surface. But mathematically, they inevitably hit what's called a Fisher threshold. That's a breaking point where unanchored growth directly causes peripheral decline, regional fragility, and the severe erosion of mentorship. But by aggressively applying an AM-regulator, we enforce adaptive stabilization. That means growth is forced to be rotational and distributed, ensuring that as the system gets larger, it actually becomes stronger, not more fragile. There's a quote from Vogt that perfectly captures this. Without restraint, innovation becomes accumulation without continuity, acceleration without sovereignty,
modernization without resilience. It's a heavy thought. When we prioritize Nimrodic expansion over the deep, necessary bonds of continuity, we are literally, and I mean literally, trading our long-term survival for short-term prestige.
Which brings us to part 3, looking at some historical proof with the astronomy bridge.
Astronomy is actually the perfect historical proof of Vox's top-down historical funnel in action. I mean, throughout history, astronomical knowledge routinely survived warfare, plagues, and completely collapsing empires. And why? Precisely because it was anchored in regulated continuity rather than rapid expansion. We're talking about a continuous thread from monastic scriptoria in late medieval Europe to the massive observatories of the Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad and Cordoba, preserving that trans-regional knowledge. By the time we hit the Renaissance, figures like Copernicus were inheriting centuries of this mathematically regulated continuity.
And the reason astronomy functioned as such an incredible, distributed, civilizational architecture is because it forced completely fragmented societies to confront scales way larger than their immediate petty conflicts. It's actually a wild fact of history that violently competing empires would regularly grant safe passage to astronomers crossing their borders. They just mutually understood that the preservation of the cosmos and the calendar outweighed absolutely any local territorial war.
So, whether we're talking about Paulo Freire addressing illiterate farm workers in the fields of Brazil, or Savio Antonio Vogt mapping the geometry of complex space systems in Italy, the absolute golden rule of resilience remains exactly identical. Restraint and relationship must come before expansion. Real sovereignty requires the discipline to build those unshakable relationships way before you ever attempt to build an empire.
All right, let's move into part 4, the ultimate goal, which brings us to pedagogia. Both of our thinkers knew that true survival goes way beyond whatever happens in a classroom. Vogt calls this invisible architecture pedagogia. It's basically the process by which meaning actually survives after formal instruction ends. It has to pass through 3 vital, incredibly unforgiving filters: trust, authority, and memory. And look, without those 3 filters actively operating in a society, true educational meaning simply cannot be transmitted from one generation to the next.
It forms this continuous loop. Transmission preserves memory, memory cultivates trust, trust legitimizes institutions, and so on. This is how mastery is quite literally earned through fire. Real resilience, it's never forged in comfortable, isolated classrooms. It's forged in adversity. Just look back at the extreme frontiers of Recife and Kolkata. Surviving in those environments absolutely demands shared cultural bonds. The continuous reconstruction of this specific geometry is literally the only thing that keeps a people alive when all the formal systems completely fail.
This brings us back to the stark difference between information and meaning. Mechanical, easily replicated information, that is exactly what Freire warned us about with his banking model. Lifeless data just deposited into passive minds. But true human meaning requires lived experience, and it requires the earned authority found in pedagogia. An educational system might be fully capable of transmitting unprecedented, massive quantities of raw data, but it can still entirely fail to transmit the actual meaning required to keep its civilization from collapsing.
Finally, let's wrap up with part 5, guardrails and maintaining continuity.
The shared lesson from these masters of resilience is just so profound. Whether you're looking from the bottom up at societal oppression or from the top down at the rigid geometry of complex systems, survival is ultimately a choice. We have to decide right here and now if we are building deep roots or if we're just rapidly expanding a really fragile illusion. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What are we actually passing on to the next generation? Just raw data or the wisdom to survive?